Margaret Reynolds, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher, had spent the afternoon running errands, checking off the small but necessary tasks of daily life. The grocery store had been busy, filled with the chatter of families, the hum of checkout scanners, and the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels. Now, with her trunk packed neatly with bags, fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few indulgences like her favorite herbal tea, she was finally on her way home. Richmond, Virginia, had been her home for over 3 decades. She knew every street, every turn, every familiar face in her quiet neighborhood. As she drove down the wide, tree-lined roads, sunlight flickered through the branches, casting warm patterns on the pavement. The houses, standing tall and well-kept, had always given her a sense of security. But as she reached for the radio dial, hoping to catch a bit of her favorite jazz station before arriving home, something caught her attention in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser. At first, she barely noticed it. Police cars were common enough, and she had no reason to be concerned. But something about the way it followed her, steady and close, made her stomach tighten slightly. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe they were just patrolling the area. Maybe they weren't even looking at her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling creeping up her spine, the kind of quiet, instinctual unease that had become all too familiar in her lifetime. Then, the flash of red and blue lights. Margaret inhaled sharply, her fingers instinctively tightening on the steering wheel. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Had she forgotten to signal? Was there a problem with her car? No, she had been careful. She was always careful. Her heartbeat remained steady, but a quiet tension settled in her chest as she signaled and pulled over to the curb. The street was empty except for a few parked cars, their owners tucked away inside their homes, unaware of the scene unfolding outside. She put the car in park, took a deep breath, and glanced back at the police vehicle. The officers hadn't stepped out yet, but she could see movement inside. What did they want? Margaret had lived long enough to know that not every traffic stop was routine. Some were nothing more than a misunderstanding. Others, well, she had seen too many stories on the news to ignore the possibility of something more. She exhaled slowly, reaching for her purse where her license and registration were tucked safely inside. Stay calm, move carefully, keep your hands visible. It was a script she had memorized over the years, a silent rule passed down through generations, one she had hoped, by now, wouldn't be necessary. But as the car door of the cruiser opened and the officers stepped out, Margaret couldn't ignore the way her breath felt just a little bit heavier. This was just another Thursday afternoon. Until it wasn't. Margaret watched through the side mirror as 2 officers exited the police cruiser. Their movements deliberate, their expressions unreadable behind dark sunglasses. One walked toward her driver's side door while the other remained a few steps behind, his hand resting lightly near his holster. A trained stance, one she had seen before, alert, cautious, prepared for confrontation. A sharp knock on her window made her flinch. She turned her head slowly, meeting the reflective lenses of the officer staring down at her. License and registration, he demanded, his voice clipped and devoid of pleasantries. No greeting, no explanation, just those 3 words. Margaret inhaled through her nose, steadying herself. Stay calm, move deliberately, no sudden gestures. She had taught her students the importance of measured actions, of thinking before reacting. And now she reminded herself of the same lesson. Her fingers moved with careful precision as she reached toward the passenger seat. Where her purse rested, she kept her hands in full view, her movements slow and deliberate, because she knew the rules. She had lived by them for decades. As she retrieved the documents, she spoke in an even tone. May I ask why I was pulled over? The officer shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. He seemed almost irritated that she had asked. That was the first sign. Your vehicle matches the description of a stolen car, he replied curtly. Margaret's brow lifted slightly, her fingers tightening on the edge of her registration card. A stolen car? She had owned this sedan for nearly a decade. It had been a reliable companion on grocery runs, Sunday church visits, and trips to see friends. The idea that it could somehow be mistaken for a stolen vehicle was almost laughable, almost. Her first instinct was to protest, to insist that a mistake had been made. But she knew better. So instead, she kept her voice steady. A stolen car? She repeated, tilting her head slightly. The officer didn't elaborate. He didn't ask follow-up questions or clarify any details. He simply reached out, snatching the documents from her hand with a dismissive motion before turning back toward his cruiser. Margaret's gaze followed him as he walked away, her breath slow and controlled. Something about the way he had taken her papers, the way he had spoken, brusque, detached, almost rehearsed, made her stomach tighten. This wasn't just a routine stop. And she had the sinking feeling that they weren't looking for a stolen car. They were looking for something else. Margaret's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, watching as the first officer strode back to his cruiser, her documents clutched in his hand. What exactly was he checking? The car was registered in her name. Her license was valid. There was no reason for concern, at least. There shouldn't have been. Yet, the second officer didn't move. He remained by her car, his posture rigid, his eyes sweeping over the backseat. Margaret could feel the weight of his gaze, the way it lingered on her neatly packed grocery bags, as if he expected to find something incriminating hidden among the cartons of milk and fresh vegetables. His fingers drummed lightly against the edge of his belt, mere inches from his holstered weapon. A subtle, silent warning. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. The question was casual on the surface, but Margaret recognized the tone underneath it, assessing, probing. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, her voice steady. "The grocery store," she replied. The officer nodded slightly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "You live around here?" he pressed. Margaret felt a slow heat rise in her chest. What did that have to do with anything? If they were truly investigating a stolen car, her home address was already on the registration they had taken. They didn't need to ask. So why were they asking? Her patience thinned. "Officer," she said, her tone firm but measured. "Is this relevant to the stop?" A beat of silence. The officer's stance stiffened slightly, his fingers still resting near his holster. His weight shifted, as if preparing for resistance. "We're just making sure everything checks out," he said. That phrase again. Margaret had heard it too many times before. It wasn't an answer, it was a deflection. A polite way of saying, "We don't need a reason to suspect you. Your presence is reason enough." She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening slightly around the wheel. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, in this moment, she was being treated like a suspect. And she wasn't sure how much worse this was going to get. The first officer returned, his expression hardened, his grip firm on the documents as he stopped at her window. There was no apology, no admission of error, just a thinly veiled tension that settled between them like a heavy fog. "This car isn't reported stolen," he admitted. Margaret held back the urge to say, "Of course it isn't." Instead, she waited, her hands still resting lightly on the steering wheel. "But we still need to verify a few things," he continued. His tone had shifted, colder now, more authoritative. Then came the words she had been dreading. "Step out of the vehicle." "Ma'am." Margaret felt it then, the shift, the subtle but undeniable turn in the situation. She had seen this before. She had read about it, heard about it, the moment when a simple stop, a so-called routine check, became something more, when suspicion clung to a person for no reason other than the fact that someone in uniform had decided it should. She knew the rules, she knew her rights. She also knew that, sometimes, knowing them wasn't enough. Her fingers flexed against the wheel before she spoke, her voice controlled but unyielding. "Is there a reason I need to exit my car?" The officer's jaw tightened. "We don't need to explain ourselves," he snapped. Margaret inhaled deeply, steadying herself. A familiar frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. But she wouldn't let it rise. She had spent over 4 decades in a classroom, teaching young minds how to think critically, how to question authority when necessary, how to recognize when something wasn't right. And she recognized it now. She wasn't just being asked to step out of the car. She was being tested. Would she comply without question? Would she back down, make it easy for them, let them push past the boundaries of what was lawful simply because they wore a badge? Or would she stand her ground? Her next words would decide everything. Margaret exhaled slowly as she reached for the door handle. Every movement was careful, deliberate, no sudden gestures, no misplaced defiance. She knew that how she moved, how she carried herself in this moment, could dictate what happened next. She pushed the door open and stepped out, planting both feet firmly on the pavement. The late afternoon air was thick, heavy with the kind of tension that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. The officer in front of her squared his shoulders, watching her every motion like he expected something to go wrong. "Do you have any weapons on you?" he asked. Margaret raised an eyebrow. She stood before them in a simple blouse and a soft cardigan that hung loosely over her frame. Her slacks were practical, her shoes modest. Did she look like someone carrying a weapon? "I do not," she answered, her voice level. The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked over her, as if he didn't quite believe her, as if her very existence warranted suspicion. Then, he shifted his attention to the car. Mind if we take a look inside your trunk? Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. Do you have probable cause? The words hung between them like a challenge, a test, a reminder. She saw it then, the flicker of hesitation in his expression. He hadn't expected her to ask. He had expected her to comply, to nod and step aside, to let them violate her space simply because they had the authority to request it. The second officer, the one who had been lingering near her backseat earlier, shifted uncomfortably. The first officer cleared his throat. We're just making sure everything checks out. That phrase again. Margaret had heard it too many times before. It was a deflection, a shield, a way to avoid saying what was really happening. This wasn't about a stolen car. It wasn't about routine procedure. It was about control, and Margaret Reynolds wasn't about to hand hers over so easily. Margaret inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had spent decades in a classroom, teaching young minds to think critically, to question when something didn't feel right. Now, standing under the weight of suspicion that had no justification, she reminded herself of those same lessons. She had played their game long enough. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan. The officers tensed, their eyes flicked to her hand, their bodies instinctively stiffening. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out her phone. Not a weapon, not a threat, just a phone. She unlocked the screen with a smooth swipe of her thumb and scrolled through her contacts. Her expression unreadable. The only sound was the distant hum of passing cars, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, she pressed a number and lifted the phone to her ear. The officers exchanged glances, shifting ever so slightly on their feet. She could see it, the first hint of doubt creeping into their posture. They had expected compliance. They hadn't expected this. After a few rings, the call connected. Hey, sweetheart, she said, her voice light, almost casual. I'm fine, but these officers seem to think I'm a car thief. Silence. The first officer's jaw tightened. The second officer's fingers twitched near his belt. The dynamic had changed. Margaret waited a beat, then delivered the final blow. I'll let you speak to them, she said, extending the phone outward. The U.S. Attorney General would like a word. The shift was immediate. The first officer blinked, his previous confidence flickering. The second officer took a half step back, his eyes darting between Margaret and his partner, suddenly unsure of his footing in the situation. For the first time since this encounter began, Margaret wasn't the one under scrutiny. They were. Margaret extended the phone toward them, her grip steady. Go ahead, she said, her voice light, almost inviting. Neither officer moved at first. It was as if the weight of her words had momentarily frozen them in place. The first officer, Carter, as his badge read, hesitated, his jaw tightening. His partner stood rigid, his fingers twitching slightly against his belt. The voice on the other end of the line was sharp, authoritative. This is Attorney General Daniel Reynolds. The voice stated without pause. Who am I speaking to? Carter swallowed, the confident air he had maintained moments ago now visibly faltering. Officer Carter with the Richmond PD. He answered, his voice lacking its previous assertiveness. There was a brief pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to remind them of exactly who they were dealing with. Then, Daniel Reynolds spoke again. And tell me, Officer Carter, he said, his tone measured but edged with steel. Why are you detaining my mother? Carter shifted uncomfortably. His partner, who had been watching the exchange in silence, suddenly seemed very interested in the pavement beneath his feet. We were conducting a routine stop, Carter said weakly, as if saying the words out loud might somehow make them true. Daniel didn't miss a beat. You forced a 68-year-old woman out of her car. You asked to search her vehicle without probable cause. That's not routine. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Margaret didn't move. She didn't need to. The balance of power had shifted, and they all knew it. For the first time in the encounter, it was the officers who were being questioned, and this time, they had no good answers. The officers realized their mistake. It was written all over their faces, the way their shoulders stiffened, the way their eyes darted toward each other as if silently deciding who would speak first. The confidence, the authority they had carried into this stop was fading fast, replaced by something else, uncertainty. Carter cleared his throat, his jaw tensed, his fingers curling slightly at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried before. We may have overstepped, he admitted reluctantly. Margaret arched an eyebrow. May have? The second officer, who had been the more aggressive of the two, remained silent. His gaze flickered downward, avoiding eye contact, as if the asphalt beneath them had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. The badge on his chest gleamed under the sunlight, but in this moment, it seemed to carry less weight than it had minutes ago. Carter took a shallow breath, as if trying to regain some control. Ma'am, we were just doing our jobs. Margaret didn't flinch, she didn't blink. When she spoke, her voice was steady, unwavering. No, you weren't. Silence. A beat passed, then Daniel's voice came through the phone once more. Calm but firm, each word slicing through the quiet like a blade. I want both of your badge numbers. Carter hesitated, his lips parted as if to protest. But he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he let out a slow breath, reached for his notepad, and scribbled something down. He tore the paper from the pad and handed it to Margaret without a word. His partner followed suit, though his hands trembled slightly as he did. Margaret took the papers, folding them neatly without looking at what was written. She didn't need to, not yet. They had just given her exactly what she needed. The officers had spent the last several minutes treating her like a suspect. Now, they were the ones on edge. And for the first time since this stop began, Margaret felt something shift inside her, not relief, not satisfaction, but the quiet certainty that she had taken back control. Margaret slid back into her car with dignity. Her movements measured, deliberate. She shut the door with a quiet finality, sealing herself off from the weight of the encounter. Through the windshield, she caught a glimpse of the officers standing near their cruiser. They weren't talking now. There were no more orders, no clipped demands, just silence. She didn't give them another glance. With steady hands, she adjusted the rearview mirror, took a slow breath, and pulled away from the curb. As she drove, the quiet hum of the engine did little to still her thoughts. This wasn't over. It never really was. The issue wasn't that her son was the U.S. Attorney General. The issue was that she had needed to say his title at all. That without his name, without his influence, things could have unraveled in a very different way. And they had, for so many others. She had spent decades following the rules, teaching the rules, believing, hoping, that the rules were meant to protect. But today had reminded her of a truth she had long known but never accepted. Sometimes the rules bent depending on who you were. The houses of her neighborhood came into view. The same ones she had passed for years. The same tree-lined streets she had once thought of as a sanctuary. But something felt different now. The quiet didn't feel as comforting. The familiarity no longer felt like security. She pulled into her driveway and cut the engine. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the house she had built a life in. She should have been thinking about dinner. About the book she had left unfinished on the coffee table. About the warmth of home. Instead, all she could think about was how quickly things had escalated. How easily it had happened. How differently it could have ended if she had been someone else, someone without a lifeline. Without a voice powerful enough to silence the wrong ones. The weight of that realization settled over her, heavier than the grocery bags in her trunk. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. You okay? Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. I will be. She set the phone down, exhaled, and reached for the kettle. Because if there was one thing she had learned in her 68 years, it was this: justice wasn't guaranteed. Dignity had to be defended. And silence was never an option. Not today. Not ever. Thank you for watching. This isn't just one story, it's a reality for far too many. If this made you think, if this made you feel something, don't stay silent. Share this. Speak up. Stand for what's right. And remember, justice isn't given. It's demanded. Stay aware. Stay strong. And I'll see you in the next one.